Rebecca and I were here probably about as early as we've ever been, but I'm late getting started. I don't know how that happened, but yeah. You must have had to run here this morning to keep warm. Okay, there you go. Okay. He's still not. Okay, let's we'll start with a prayer. And we're going to ask Troy to lead us in that prayer, please, if you'll go ahead and do that.
Father God, we thank you so very much for this day that you blessed us with to be able to be here and to worship you, Father, to open up your word and study a portion of that. We pray, Father, that you give God this time as he teaches, and pray that he has a remembrance of the things he's prepared, and we can understand and apply those things from your word to our lives. Father, thank you for Margaret and for everyone who is here to ask you to continue to bless the congregation. Father, please forgive us of our sins where we have failed you. All this we pray and ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Troy. And immediately after class, if I can ask you to help me with something, if you might not be able to, and that'll be fine, but if you can, that'll be helpful. Yes, and it's yeah, it's a huge box with Joey's name on it. Okay. So we started last week to look at the indigenous method in practice, and we were talking about how, keeping in mind that indigenous means native, that we're talking about when we plant congregations on the foreign mission field, that we want them to be native congregations that are run and attended by local people. Rebecca and I were just talking to the missionaries that are now in Pohnpei that took over for us, and they were telling us that they've just had a baptism, 2 baptisms actually, it was a couple, and this couple's been going to worship for a long time. I think about 6-7 months they've been coming to worship regularly, not missing a service, and they've finally just become Christians. And that, in my experience, is usually the best indicator of whether or not somebody will be faithful after they become a Christian, is whether or not they'll actually attend while they're still studying and before they become a Christian. And so we're hoping, we have high hopes for that couple over there in Pohnpei. We wanted to, and we talked last week about how right from the beginning in the evangelism process, we want to start by showing total commitment to Christ. So long before we ever get to baptism, long before we ever get to the worship of the church, we want to recognize that we're giving ourselves to Christ. And Doug Lee did a great job Wednesday night of explaining that. If you weren't here for his devotional talk, it was really good. But the idea is that you convince somebody to be totally committed to Christ, and then you don't have to argue with them about baptism. You don't have to argue with them about how to worship. It just comes naturally. Now, in evangelism, along with those things, along with teaching total commitment to Christ, along with teaching different things about how to become a Christian, different things about the church, very often it's the case that you have to do a lot of unteaching, okay? In other words, you have people that come to the Bible with preconceived notions, and often it is a denominational background. And you have to sort of unteach them a lot of the things and a lot of the habits and a lot of the practices they might have. I have a friend who's a missionary in Thailand. He's actually Thai, married to an American woman that was raised in Thailand, but they do mission work there in Thailand. And one time I asked him, when we were there visiting them, I asked him, what in your experience, who's easier to teach? Somebody who has no denominational affiliation at all, a Hindu, a Buddhist, mostly Buddhist there in Thailand, or somebody from a denominational background? And he said it's no contest. It's much, much easier to teach a Buddhist about Jesus than it is to teach a Baptist about the Church of Christ. He said because there's just no unteaching. Everything's new to them. Rebecca and I experienced that in Ireland with a woman that we taught and baptized there. She was a Jewish woman, though they were not practicing Jews. She just grew up culturally maybe Jewish, but not actually practicing the religion. She knew nothing about Jesus. She had very few preconceived notions about him, knew nothing about the church, had very few preconceived notions about the church. So we just showed her the scriptures, and she read things and came to the conclusion, the right conclusion, because there was nothing in the background sort of holding her back from seeing the truth. And so that happens a lot when you are teaching somebody. One of the things, as it comes to the indigenous method of teaching people or unteaching people, people who, for example, have the background like I had. I was Catholic. And in Catholicism, only certain people are allowed to do certain things in the church services, mostly the priest. And then they have deacons who do some things, and they have altar boys that do some things. So when I first became a Christian, and they said, you know, if you want to, you're welcome to help out on the Lord's table. That was something that was a very foreign concept to me. I said, oh, well, I've not been ordained. I'm just a layman, you know. Well, in the church and in the Bible, there is no such thing as laity. There's no such thing as clergy. We're all one in Christ. And we might have different roles, but everybody is welcome to participate in the services, to teach others, to baptize people. In Pohnpei, we always would... I tried to baptize very few people. I tried to let the locals baptize people. But that would really sometimes bother them. They'd say, well, I can't do that. Well, sure you can. You know, we would study in the Scripture that the Bible never emphasizes the baptizer, only the baptizee. Now, maybe you could argue that with John the Baptist, it was emphasizing him. But other than that, in the after the resurrection, that was never a part of it again. We also have that idea that becomes a problem with preaching. A lot of people think you have to be ordained to preach. And you don't. You just have to be a Christian. That's it. And you just have to know something. That's helpful. But, you know something that you can share, right? Sometimes it seems like we don't know what we're talking about, but it is helpful. My father had a huge problem with this when I first went to preaching school. I would preach. While I was in preaching school, I would go to area congregations and fill in. And my dad would say, well, how can you do that? You're not a preacher. I'd say, sure I am. And he'd say, no, you haven't graduated yet. And he said, you haven't been ordained. I said, no, Dad, anybody can preach. And then he got really confused because we went to a congregation and they called me the minister. And he said, oh, you're not a preacher, you're a minister. I said, Dad, no, there's not. Get all those titles out of your mind. It's all the same thing. Don't worry about it. Of course, other than what is said about gender roles, any Christian can preach. I think I did this once before in this class, but raise your hand if you talked to a priest this morning. Raise your hand if you talked to a priest this morning. Jack did. Okay, we're getting it a little bit. Yep. Everybody did, right? If you talk to a Christian, because Revelation chapter 1:5, he has made us a kingdom of priests. Okay? Everyone in this room who's a Christian is a priest. Now, don't call each other father unless you're actually the father of that person. But but you know, anybody can preach. Anybody can participate in the services and in the leadership of the church. And that's part of that indigenous method. You have to teach that early. Teach it early so that person knows. The person knows what they can do and that they will get involved. You can start training people right away. As far as usually in Pohnpei, the very first thing we would have somebody do is lead a prayer on a Wednesday night or something like that, just to get their feet wet. You know, help them get in front of people, help them get, what's that now? Well, yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, okay. It's just a figure of speech. What's that now? Yeah, we might need to do that. And one way is to make a congregation indigenous is to help people lead in worship. And again, one way to do that is when you're teaching somebody the gospel, find out what their likes are, what their dislikes are. Find out what they're comfortable doing, what they're not comfortable doing. Is this person a school teacher? You know, are they are they normally in front of people speaking? Maybe they've never done that. Maybe they're very shy. You can even tell that just from interacting with them. But put them in a role that they're comfortable with and help them to do those jobs. When, again, in Pohnpei, in order to move people towards this idea of being indigenous, native, we had a man that was converted pretty early on, within the first couple of years that we were there. His name was Eliza, and he was a great song leader. He was probably one of the very best song leaders we ever had. But he was from an outer island of Pohnpei. He was actually Polynesian, and he owned a handicraft shop. He carved little handicrafts, and then he sold them. He also bought them from other people and sold them on their behalf on consignment. Well, he managed a business. He had his own shop. And when it came time, when our collection started growing, and it came time to open a bank account, we made him our treasurer. We said, this is a man who is trustworthy. He keeps books for his business. He does this for other people because he's selling other people's handicrafts. Let's make him the treasurer. And he did a great job with it. He excelled at it. Not my uncle, Rebecca's uncle, Ken, he was a firefighter up in Ohio, and he was, I think, the treasurer for their union or something like that. And when he moved to Tennessee and became a member of the church where he was, they made him the treasurer. It made sense because that was his experience. We had several in the church there in Pohnpei that were carpenters, and when we planted a new church, if we had to build a building, they're the ones that did it. If we had to repair something in the building, they would do it. So find where people fit and put them in those positions. So one of the ways you can help develop people too in this regard is spending time with people, not just during the evangelism process, but after that. We emphasize a lot here at Margaret Street and in every church I've been involved with that we're a family, right? We even sing that song, we're part of the family. Families spend time together. And sometimes, I've been in congregations or been involved in congregations where they say, we're a family, but nobody knows anybody. Nobody ever hangs out together. Nobody visits anybody. And we don't want that. And on the mission field, it's particularly important because you're usually dealing with smaller groups of people who are going to be easily discouraged. So you want to spend time with people, and when you're spending time with them, talk to them about these things. Talk to them about how you can grow and become a leader in the church and how that is necessary. We need to be spending time with people, and in our modern age, we're always so busy. It's hard to find time, but we need to find that time. I want to say something very quickly. I don't think he's in the room, so it's better to brag on somebody when they're not in the room than when they are. But yeah, you can tell them later if you want to. But just this past Thursday, I had the privilege. For those of you who don't know, we are borrowing Miss Josie's car while we've been here. She saved us a ton of money by allowing us to borrow that car. And the very day that we borrowed it, it was actually the very day I met Miss Josie. She said, "I'm so glad you're borrowing my car. Now you can take me to go visit people." I said, "Oh, okay. So this comes with the price, okay." But what a price! It's a great deal for me.
Smart lady.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Thursday, and with Jack getting sick and then dying, and then the holidays, we haven't had time to do that. Well, Thursday we did. We went to a number of different houses, visited a few of the shut-ins. I got to meet them for the first time. All very lovely people, but they all have one thing in common. Every single one that we went to, that we actually managed to visit, they said this. They said, John Pace comes and visits me all the time. They said he is really good about coming and spending time with you. And he says he's retired and he's got work and things that he has to do, but he can come and visit. What a great example that was for me, and I hope it's a good example for you. Get a list of the shut-ins from Troy, or if there's a way to find them, and go and visit them. One of the ladies that we visited, she was telling us about how her sister is in Alabama, and she's shut in, and nobody from the church visits her. And she said, it's so discouraging. She said, we grew up there. She said, my dad bought the property for the building, and nobody from that church goes and visits my sister. And then she said, but, John Pace comes and visits me. And she said, and Troy calls and comes and visits. And she said, there's other people that come and visit. She said, Margaret Street's great at that. And that's good, but we need to follow that example. Anyway, that has really very little to do with our, I feel like something is wrong on my clothing this morning. This tie is like twisted inside, and it's really bothering me. Sorry. That's why I keep fidgeting. I'm not usually that fidgety. But anyway, that's besides the point. But the idea is we want to get to know people on a personal level, and you do that by spending time with people. That was one of the great things about Pohnpei. It was not quite this way in Ireland, but in Pohnpei, people have time. They're not concerned about all the things we're concerned about, so they can spend time with you, and you can spend time with people. And that was great. In Ireland, they do have more of a mindset like we do, but we were able to spend a lot of time visiting with folks. One thing about Ireland is, and in Italy it'll be this way too, they like to stay up late. They do things late at night. They usually won't eat dinner until 9, 10 o'clock at night, so you can visit people late there. So that's good. That gives you a little bit more time too. Okay, now when you are trying to plant a congregation and you want the folks there to be involved and be leaders, you're going to come into some obstacles, some problems. One problem you're going to come into is that some people just don't want to be leaders, right? And some people don't want to preach. Some people don't want to get in front of the congregation. Some people don't want to teach Bible class. Now, we were blessed, again in Pohnpei, we were blessed that we had a couple of ladies that would always teach Bible class. They would always teach the children's class. And by the way, in Pohnpei, it was the children's class. It was age 2, I think, to 12 or something like that. But the ladies did a great job of teaching a broad range of folks. Here at Margaret Street, we have, I don't know how many Bible classes do we have, Oscar, do you know? About 15 different classes, two teachers for each class. And we have Wednesday nights and Sunday evenings. So it's actually a lot of people involved. What's that? Dance? What? No? Wednesday class is what it's. Wednesday night class. We don't have a Wednesday dance. He was. He said, well, maybe. That's what it is. Okay. But it's hard to find people who want to teach. And there's no difference between here and the mission field when it comes to that. Some people just don't want to do it. Some people feel like they can't do it. I don't know how to do it. Well, we'll train you. We'll teach you. And some people are just shy. It might be shyness, might be laziness, might be they have a time-consuming job. It could be anything. But what we want to do is just encourage people to do what they can without pushing them away. Okay? You want to make sure you don't push people away either, but get them involved. Now, for the men, just about anybody can do this with a tray. I mean, that's easy, right? So we can do that, and that's usually, other than maybe leading prayers, that was almost always the very first thing we asked somebody to do in the church there in Pohnpei. But then they would sometimes that would scare them off too. Sometimes they just didn't like to do that. They didn't like to put themselves out in front. Another challenge we had in Pohnpei, you wouldn't have this here, but in a lot of places you would, is reputation. There was a guy that we converted in Pohnpei. I say we, God gave the increase, but we taught him. And he was a real bad guy before becoming a Christian, as many of us were. But he was particularly bad. And we were on this little island of about 40,000 to 50,000 people, and everybody knows everybody on that island. They tried to start, I was talking one time to a Catholic missionary about dealing with alcoholism on the island, because it's a big problem there. And so he said, well, somebody tried to start a chapter of Alcoholics Anonymous here, and he said it didn't work. I said, why not? He said, because there's no anonymous here. There's just everybody knows everyone, And there's this guy that I'm thinking of. He's been a Christian now since 2007, so what's that, 12 years this year? And people still, when he goes out to try to teach them the gospel, will say, well, I remember what you were like before. And that causes problems. And it does limit people in how much leadership they can have. Now, that's a little bitty island. I'm assuming in small villages in Africa or India or, in places that are more rural, that would also be a problem. Now, Asuncion's a pretty big city, right? So maybe not there, but maybe within that person's very own family, that could also be a problem. And you've got to just try to work through it. And sometimes you do the best you can. And like we said last week, we were talking about how sometimes you run into people with prejudices. Again, maybe somebody won't listen to a preacher from a different culture. You just have to do your best. You can't, you can't force people to listen. You just do your best and see what can happen. Again, another thing, and this happens right here in the United States, but when you're trying to develop an indigenous congregation where you want people to be, the local people to be leaders, one thing that'll get in the way is work, right? A lot of people work, 40, 50 hours a week. I remember I heard when I was a kid, all the time, I heard growing up, a full-time job is 40 hours a week. And then I got my first full-time job, and I said, this is a lot more than 40 hours a week. What do you, especially if you add commute time, too, in some places. Yep, okay, that's a number. But sometimes that's going to be a problem for people in leadership. And again, you just have to try to work your way around it and be understanding. And don't put too much on somebody that they wind up, again, you scare them off. You do want to capitalize on what time people have available. So, just try to do your best, but keep that in mind. And then, of course, it's a problem that stage fright and shyness is a problem when it comes to preaching. But not everybody has to be a preacher, right? Not everybody has to be a Bible class teacher. Now, again, when you're in a starting congregation and you only have a handful of people, you might want for everybody to be doing those things, but not everybody can do it, and not everybody will. Don't force people to do things they're not comfortable doing, but encourage those that can do it to do so, okay? All right, now, so that's just some of the ways of getting indigenous congregations going, keeping in mind to start right from the beginning. During the evangelism process, we want these people to know you've got to commit yourself fully to Christ, and part of that is actually doing the work on your own, unteaching a lot of those ideas, those preconceived notions that I have to be ordained to do these things. Get that right away from the very beginning, and then just get people involved. One of the things that happened to me is when I first became a Christian, I had been visiting at the church for a while, and I was only visiting on Sunday mornings, and I was studying. And I was baptized on a Sunday, and I don't know, I think I've told a couple of you this story, but the day I was baptized, I had been thinking about becoming a Christian, and the guy who taught me, the week before I was baptized, we studied, and he asked me if I knew what I needed to do to become a Christian. And I said, yes, I do. And he said, well, you want to do it? And I said, no, I'm not ready. And he said, okay. And he backed right off. And I really appreciated him for that. Well, the next Sunday I went to church, and the preacher preached a sermon on procrastination. Yeah. And you know what? I got mad. I was sitting in that pew thinking, the guy who taught me, but the guy who taught me was not the preacher, but I remember just sitting in that pew thinking, I can't believe he told him about me, and now he's preaching this sermon to me. I was livid. I was like, there's no way. These people are trying to manipulate me. There's no way I'm being baptized. Okay? Then, after the sermon, they sing a song, Why Do You Wait, Dear Brother? I said, no, you're not getting me. This isn't happening. Well, then, after a while, I sat there and I thought about it, and I realized that I was being silly. So the services ended, and I said, I want to be baptized. I was baptized. Come to find out, the preacher had never even heard of me. It was just a coincidence that he preached that sermon that day. But I became a Christian that Sunday morning. And I lived about 45 minutes away from the church building, and the family that taught me, they said, hey, you can just come hang out at our house until the evening services, come to the evening services, and then you can go on back home. And I said, oh, okay, I guess Christians are supposed to worship Sunday morning and Sunday night. Okay. And I've done that ever since I became a Christian because I never knew any different. When you're on the mission field, get people to work, or even here, when you convert somebody, get people to work right away, and they'll never know anything different. And they'll never know I didn't have to do these things. No, it's not. I suppose if you're lying, it is, but just, hey, can you help on the Lord's table this week? Well, I don't know how to do that. We'll teach you. Don't worry about it. And get people to work right away. Okay, now. Okay, so when you are, one of the ways that this helps, I'm on page 19 in your notes, if that's helpful to you at all. One of the first things to do as a missionary on the mission field, and one of the very most important things to do, is to learn as much as you can about the culture and the language right away. Rebecca and I are studying Italian, and we've been doing it for a few weeks now. Our tutor tells us we're doing a great job, but she gets paid to say that, so I don't know if we really are or not. But we're making little progress little by little. Hopefully when we get on the field and you're immersed, it can be a little bit easier. But learning a new language can be hard. It's a huge challenge. People always ask, well, what's the easiest foreign language to learn? There's not one. They're all difficult. They're all very hard. And even if you already speak a foreign language, that doesn't guarantee that the next one would be easy. Now, Troy might have an easier time with Italian than I would just because it's similar to Spanish. But even he, if he were to speak to Italian people, would probably use Spanish words and confuse things, sometimes. So it's always going to be difficult. But learning the language, you want to learn how to communicate with the people you're working with. Now, that's true, by the way, even here in the United States. We have different regions, right, and different manners of speaking in different places. And I'll tell you something. If you were going to go, maybe not from northwest Florida, but, well, yeah, I think so. If you're going to go up to New York or Massachusetts and try to teach people the gospel, and you said, hey, how y'all doing? You're gonna turn them off right away, just that word y'all. But if I come down here, especially in Georgia, hey, how you guys doing? You guys, oh, this is a Yankee, get out of here. You need to learn how to talk to the people you're working with, right? Even if it's English. Let me tell you something that happened to me and Rebecca when we first got married. Now, Rebecca grew up in East Tennessee. She's only recently started wearing shoes. Oh, that was bad. I'm sorry, Rebecca. Sorry. No. What's that now? She has always pronounced the letter R. That's new to me. But in East Tennessee, well, where I grew up, right, if I say I don't care to do something, that means I don't want to do it, okay? If I say, like, oh, I don't care to go to that, that means I don't want to do it. Where Rebecca grew up, it means the exact opposite. It means, oh, I don't care to do that. That'd be great. Like, it doesn't bother me to do that. That's the way they use that in that little part of I've never been anywhere else where they used it that way. But, so when Rebecca and I first got married, she would ask me if I wanted to do something. I'd say, oh, I don't care to do that. And she'd say, oh, great, we're going to do that. And I said, no, we're not. There's a miscommunication. You've got to learn how the people where you work communicate and how they talk to one another. In Ireland, this was a huge, not a huge thing, but it was sometimes we would get in a little bit of a communication problem because they speak English, but in a much different way than you and I speak English. I'm trying to think of an exact example, well, tea. Hey, you want to come over for tea? Right, they'll say that, but they'll also say tea But to them, it's not just coming for a cup of tea. It's a meal. They want food. If you have them over for tea, you better have food, right? It's a difference. You've got to be. That's just one way. Now, we worked with some Australians when we were in Micronesia, and boy, they speak. Their English is completely different. We were talking to one time, and he told me something happened. He said, "I nearly carked it." You know what that means? I don't do the accent, but I nearly cocked it. You nearly what? And it means I nearly died. I nearly carked it. I don't know how they got carked out of corpse, but they did. And that we had, one time we were talking to an Australian person, and we had been back in the States reporting. I said, well, we drove all over creation. And I couldn't believe she didn't understand it, but she said, where's creation? I said, no, it just means we drove around, you know. But you have to learn how to communicate with people, even when you're speaking English. You might say something and somebody else might hear something completely different. Here's another one. A friend of mine, Robert Martin, and a friend of Troy's as well, he had done mission work in Fiji for a long time. And one morning, his wife didn't come to worship. And he said, sorry, her wife's name is Mary. He said, sorry, Mary can't be here today. She's under the weather. And you know, now, to you and me, that means she's sick. To them, it meant she was drunk. Yeah. He got up and told the whole congregation his wife couldn't be at worship because she was drunk. You got to be careful. You've got to be careful. Yeah. Now, now, one thing about learning another language, especially if it's, you know, like in Pohnpeian or Guarani, is that how you say that? Guarani? Y'all might not know this. Troy actually speaks 3 languages. He speaks English, sort of, and he speaks Spanish. And if there's any Spanish speakers, they can tell me how good he really is. No, I'm sure he's good. And, well, you'll have to ask him that. But he also speaks another language called Guarani. Troy, do they have a Rosetta Stone program for Guarani? No, they do not. It's a local Paraguayan native. It's an Indian dialect, yeah. So the actual indigenous language, Spanish, was brought in. So there's that can be that's a difficult language to learn. Pohnpeian, there were no resources at all. There's still very few resources. The way we learned was just by making a lot of mistakes and by just keep practicing until you get it. If you're going to learn a second language and try to communicate with people in their own language, you have to be prepared to be laughed at, okay? Now, I don't care if somebody laughs at me. I prefer they laugh with me. But, you know, in Pohnpei, let me tell you something about Pohnpeians. None of you have ever met a Pohnpeian. We hope to bring some to church sometime. But Pohnpeians live to correct your Pohnpeian pronunciation. That is, they just sit when you're talking, they just wait. Okay, he's going to say something wrong. I know it. They do this to each other, though, too. They just love correcting each other's language. So you have to have a thick skin, and you can't let things bother you. Learning Italian, I get frustrated a lot. I keep using the wrong articles. So they have the masculine and feminine. I keep using the feminine when I say la when I'm supposed to say ill, and it gets very, very frustrating. And you want to just quit and give up. But you know what happens when you're learning another language is what's challenging today is easy next week. It just, little by little, you get to know it. And eventually, it becomes second nature. One of the things about learning Pohnpeian was, or is, and Guarani, completely useless now. Now that we don't live there. The only thing that Pohnpeian is good for is if Rebecca and I want to talk to each other and not have anybody else know what we mean. If we have a secret, we can do it. And we do that in front of Violet because now she's learning how to spell, so we have to speak Pohnpeian to each other when we don't want her to know what we're saying. Yeah, well, of course. Violet's not in the room. It's okay. She's fine. Turn in your Bibles when we look at different languages and the importance of learning the language where you are working. let's look at Mark chapter 16, verse 17 and 18. Mark chapter 16, verse 17 and 18, Jesus, after giving the Great Commission, says, "And these signs will follow those who believe in my name. They will cast out demons. They will speak with new tongues. They will take up serpents, and if they drink anything deadly, it will by no means hurt them. They will lay hands on the sick, and they will recover." Now, verse 17, he says, they will speak with new tongues. Now, you and I know that that means if you're speaking in new tongues, you're going like this. Blah, 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 right? That's what that means, right? Now, what does it mean? What's that? A language. A language you have not studied. I'll tell you, of all the spiritual gifts, well, it'd be pretty great to be able to heal people, but I would, if I could take any spiritual gift today, it would be that one. To be able to speak a language without having had to study it, because it's so hard. That's what we know. Now, we know that from Acts chapter 2, where they started to speak in new tongues, and everybody understood them in their own language because they were speaking those languages. So obviously, learning the language where you are going is important, or God would not have given that spiritual gift. It's very clear. Turn your Bibles to Acts chapter 21, and I want you to notice what Paul does, beginning in verse 37. Now, this is after Paul has been arrested in Jerusalem. The mob has tried to kill him. The centurion has come and rescued him, but only to put him in jail. But in verse 37 of Acts chapter 21, it says, "Then as Paul was about to be led into the barracks, he said to the commander, 'May I speak to you?' He replied, 'Can you speak Greek? Are you not the Egyptian who came some time ago, stirred up a rebellion, and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness?' But Paul said, 'I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I implore you, permit me to speak to the people.' So, when he had given him permission, Paul stood on the stairs and motioned with his hand to the people, and when there was a great silence, he spoke to them in the Hebrew language." Okay? Now look at chapter 22. "Brethren and fathers, hear my defense before you now." And when he heard that he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, they kept all the more silent. And then he goes on to talk to them. He's talking to that commander in Greek. Okay, now Greek was the national language, basically, of the Roman Empire. Latin was the government language and was the language in Rome. And most everybody would speak those two languages in Rome. Outside of Rome, most everybody would just speak Greek, and that was how they communicated with one another. But then in Palestine, they also spoke Hebrew. Really, probably Aramaic, but it's a little bit of a translation issue there. But notice what Paul does. To that commander, he speaks in his language, a language he'll understand. But then he shifts to Hebrew to speak to the people that understand Hebrew. And when they heard, now they also understand Greek, by the way. It's very likely most of the people there would have understood Greek. But he's speaking our language. And they were all the more silent. I'm going to tell you something. I can tell you this for a fact. That when Troy was in Paraguay, and people knew he was American, but he was speaking Spanish, that would have had an impression on them. But when he spoke Guarani, that would have shocked them. They said, wait, what, this foreigner speaking our indigenous native tongue? And I bet people listened to him just because he spoke that language. Well, he's also a good preacher, in any language, I'm sure. But that makes an impression on people. We were able to make inroads in Pohnpei after we were there a while, and we no longer needed interpreters. We could communicate with people in their language. There were people that would listen to us who wouldn't before. It's a huge thing. Even in Italy, you just try. Just try. Just make an effort to learn their language and to speak it, and they appreciate it, just like we do here in America, right? If somebody comes in and they refuse to even learn how to make pleasantries, hello, how are you, in English, You're in America. English is our national language, you know? We appreciate it when they make an effort, even if they can't do it well. Well, it's the same thing there. Our Italian tutor, I was telling her about how I have a tendency to mispronounce the words. So Rebecca and I, now that she's left the room, I'll say something nice, but I would have anyway. Even if she was here, I would have said this. Rebecca and I are a really good team when it comes to learning a language because I have a good memory for words, but Rebecca has a great tongue. She can pronounce words perfectly the first time she hears them, and I can't. I butcher them, okay? And I was telling the Italian tutor that we have, I told her, I said, well, you know, I said, I'm going to try my best, but, you know, I will mispronounce words. She said, it's okay if you mispronounce words. She said, we're not French. Because apparently the French people, if you mispronounce their words, they are not forgiving, but Italians are. And it just impresses people when you can preach to them in their language. So if you want to do indigenous mission work, do your best. It's not easy, but do your best to learn the language where you're working and encourage your missionaries to learn the language where they're working if you're supporting missionaries. I think that's brought us to just about the end of our time. We'll get into culture next week. Thank you for your attention. I hope you're enjoying the classes. I hope they're helpful to you. And I look forward to worshiping with you in here in just a few minutes. I feel all twisted up.